We could never do a full study of what's happening in the golden age of Athens without starting with a reference, and you saw this picture earlier. This is essentially the sort of picture that summarizes the best of the golden age of Athens. This is the time period after the destruction of the Persian Wars and before the failure of Athens to maintain its independence in the Peloponnesian Wars. There's roughly a century there where Athens is, for many of us in Western civilization, it is the end-all and be-all. It is the city-state that provides us with so much intellectual material in terms of drama and history and philosophy and architecture and art. And the golden age of Athens, the idea here is to talk about roughly the century of Athenian history where we have some of the most important elements of Western civilization. Now, in the last unit, we had talked about Pericles as the military leader, the general who had led Athens into the Peloponnesian War. He had been elected many different times, sort of lead general in Athens, showing how popular he was, how much support he had. The sad thing, though, is that, of course, when he died and his whole military strategy fell apart, Athens then went from being an independent polis, an independent city-state, into basically a dependent and a second-rate power under the domination of Sparta, or later on Thebes or other of the city-states inside of Greece. But in that shining moment, that sort of century of Greek flowering in the arts, Athens was the place to go. Athens was the core, and we're going to take a look at some of the key ideas, all right? Not only is the study of history a key element of understanding here, it's simply an idea like this. Many people in the civilizations we've read about and that you've seen so far essentially had this idea that history is not an objective sort of science or a telling of the facts or a recounting of the exact details. History had a combination of the acts of gods and goddesses, and it had, partly mythological monsters of different kinds and other things that were not sort of, provable, objective data. Not the kind of thing you could look up on your cell phone in Google to find out exactly the details, right? These were oftentimes a combination of oral stories, mythology, and some historical data kind of put into a blender and then served up. One of the things that the early historians in Greece are trying to do, a man named Herodotus and later on a man named Thucydides, each of them has been trying to record events. In the case of Herodotus, he was looking at some of the earlier Greek history and his activities in terms of what happened in the time frame when he was alive, and especially the Persian Wars. And Thucydides is talking more about the Peloponnesian War, because each of these men were on the edge of the participation of these events. They talked with veterans, they talked with people, they were making an active effort to make the study of history something other than mixed up with mythology or simply a connection to religion, all right? In this case, they're simply talking about how to be objective, how to apply reason to a concept or an idea. For example, let's say somebody said the army was so big that it drank a river dry. Well, wow, that's a whole river just totally disappeared? In one sense, it could be a comment on how large the army was, but then to lay that fact out with the idea that an entire river was just disappeared because they drank it dry, it seems to strain all reason, right? So in the case of both Herodotus and Thucydides, they're looking at the idea of trying to recall in a reasonable manner, an objective way of looking at the way the world has worked. And they're some of the first historians we can point out who have separated themselves out from the ideas of philosophy or religion or mythology to really take a look and study mankind. Because each of them made an active effort to talk about motives and reasons why people would do things. What was the action and how was it influenced? Why did people make a decision? What point did they come to where they made that decision? In some cases, some people would say, well, that decision just got made. Well, that's kind of a cop-out because somebody made the decision. These are the kind of early historians that would look at these things and say, listen, we need to find out some real ways of understanding and conceptualizing what happened, how, when, and why. And they are seen as sort of the fathers of early history. Also within the Golden Age of Athens, and hopefully you'll see several examples of this in the books that you're using and what you're reading online, there is a huge explosion inside of Athens of various kinds of drama. All right? Now, some of the first drama, some of the first plays are essentially tragedies, where there's a limited number of actors, there's a limited number of special effects, of course, and essentially there are usually sometimes three characters with a chorus of people in the background narrating events. Many of the actors would wear masks or makeup, and in other words, what we're looking at is the idea of displaying to humans and an audience lessons and concepts about good and evil, right and wrong, those things that are possible or not possible, talking about and commenting on everything from social behavior between spouses to warfare policy, all right? And in the early kind of era, there are Greek tragedies, and there's many of them. I would just like to point out one of them so you get a sense of some of the ideas inside of these very excellent and long-enduring tragedies. There's one called Antigone. Antigone is a woman whose brother has died, actually been killed in a battle where he was essentially he was a rebel. And one of the ways that he was sort of being snuffed out was they were not allowing him to be fully buried, that he was essentially, his body was going to be left for the animals, a sign of, sort of disdain for a rebel. Antigone, though, thinks it's a proper thing for her, as a family member, to go and do the proper rites over her family member's dead body. She defies the local political authorities, and in the process, the conversation in the tragedy is about the law says no one should touch the body. Antigone's family law and tradition and culture says, yes, I must go and do this as part of my duty to my family member. Those are the kinds of unsolvable problems inside of many Greek tragedies. Human behavior has consequences. The gods and goddesses have their own set of priorities and morality. And inside many of these plays by multiple different authors, there's generally a lot of conflict. The conflict is not just made up stuff. These are like heavy issues where people have to make real choices that make a real difference in their lives, or sometimes in their death. And they're usually problems that have no easy solution. So that the playwright is exploring some very interesting ideas in front of an audience that the audience is going to know and live with, but also these are big picture ideas, huge ideas that will carry through, and many of these early Greek tragedies as well as comedies are used later on as models by other playwrights in other cultures in Western civilization as they go and recreate what worked so well long ago, updating it, of course, changing the language and characters, but nonetheless, this idea that there are unsolvable problems in human life. If we look at another kind of Greek play, there was also comedies, right? Slapstick, sort of like, half-hour sitcom kind of things, where there'd be all kinds of silly misunderstandings and behaviors that are strange, but they're social commentary, right? Maybe there's a play where there is, in this case, we'll use Lysistrata. Lysistrata is still performed to this day. There's lots to it, so I don't want to do a spoiler alert, but here's the idea. During the war between Greek city-states, where there seems to be no victory, what if all the women in society, on both sides of the war, made their men stop? What if women could be the real peacemakers? Instead of this Greek heroic thing where the swashbuckling warrior is going to defeat his enemy and live up to his heroic deal, his heroic Homer-esque kind of idea of duty and honor, what if women could say, wait a second, this is stupid. We're expending a lot of time and energy on this when we could solve this by other ways. So essentially the premise, the idea inside Lysistrata, is women from both sides in a war in Greece go on a sex strike. They refuse to have intercourse with any of their males. And that is, on one level, a comedy in the sense that it seems rather preposterous, but the idea is very powerful. How do you get to peace? How do you get past the confrontation that the Greeks are famous for? And in this way, it's a funny way of trying to have a social commentary about things like warfare and the nature of it and its futility and its expense. What you'll also see inside of Greek plays, both comedies and dramas, Lots and lots of slapstick, lots of farcical things, lots of ridiculous things, lots of strange things where people misunderstand, sort of classic things that go into modern comedy, where people mishear something and they find a way that it's a way to understand it, but it's the wrong way. Also, there's simple conversations here about the nature of good and evil, right? And the simple idea that people are going to have to try to live together and move on. What you want to think about here is that in this Greek Athenian, especially Athenian, golden age, drama, concepts of good and evil, right and wrong. Now, some of those things you'd think would be simply religious ideas. In the Greek golden age comedies and tragedies, these are conversations in public for everybody to have. What is the nature of peace? What's the nature of justice or truth? What's the proper way to come to a conclusion or to a compromise? So that instead of having those being resided as sort of great moral issues, they're dealt with in a comedic or in a tragic way in front of an audience, and the ideas are explored very carefully and very deeply. Take a look inside your different reading materials and see which kind of Greek playwrights are being highlighted there. Hopefully there's some excerpts from some of these plays or from others, and you'll get a better sense of the kind of context and the ideas that the Greeks are dealing with. Also, make sure you go back and take a second look at many of those sample questions.